Chris Redfield has been fighting bioterrorism for 30 years. He was there when it started in the Arklay Mountains in 1998. He's been there for every major outbreak since: Africa, Antarctica, Louisiana, Romania. He's the longest-running protagonist in the Resident Evil series, and he's never stopped showing up. But somewhere along the way, he stopped being a hero and became a soldier running on obligation. By the time we see him in Village, he's not fighting because he believes he can win anymore. He's fighting because stopping would mean admitting it was all for nothing. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the complete story of Chris Redfield. From his early days as a S.T.A.R.S officer to the hollow, weary enforcer we see in Resident Evil 8. This is a story about what it costs to be the person who always shows up, and what happens when you fight a war for 3 decades without ever winning. This is Chris Redfield, the man who never stopped fighting, even when he should have. Part 1. The Air Force and the Rebellious Streak. Before Chris Redfield ever stepped foot into the Raccoon City forest, he was a man defined by the sky and a refusal to bow to unjust authority. During his tenure in the United States Air Force, Chris quickly distinguished himself as a pilot of peerless caliber, possessing a natural aptitude for flight mechanics and a legendary precision with firearms. He was the kind of airman who could push a multi-million-dollar jet to its absolute limits while maintaining the calm focus of a veteran. However, his career was not defined by his accolades, but by a recurring friction with his commanding officers. This was not a simple case of a young man with a bad attitude. It was a fundamental clash of values that would set the stage for his entire life. The rebellious streak that would eventually lead to his departure from the military was rooted in a fierce, uncompromising loyalty to his fellow airmen. Chris possessed a moral compass that often pointed in a different direction than the official chain of command, especially when he felt that orders compromised the safety or the dignity of his teammates. He was a man who believed that the person standing next to him was more important than the bureaucracy above him. This led to numerous disciplinary hearings and a reputation as a loose cannon, though his skill was so undeniable that the Air Force struggled to let him go until the tension became untenable. His exit from the Air Force was not a moment of defeat, but a refusal to bend. When faced with commands that he found morally reprehensible or strategically negligent regarding human life, Chris chose his conscience over his career. This period of his life forged the lone wolf mentality that would haunt him in his later years. He learned that the institutions meant to protect the world were often led by men with agendas that had nothing to do with justice. By the time he hung up his flight suit, he was a man without a mission, but with a set of skills that made him one of the most dangerous individuals on the planet. The mechanical skill he acquired during these years would remain a cornerstone of his identity. Chris didn't just know how to fire a weapon. He understood the engineering of the tools he used, a trait that gave him a distinct advantage in high-pressure environments. This technical proficiency, combined with his physical grit, made him an anomaly, a thinker who could act with brutal efficiency. Yet beneath the grit was a man who felt the weight of every lost comrade, even in those early years. The Air Force gave him the training, but it was his rebellious heart that gave him the drive to eventually hunt the shadows of the world. When Chris eventually left the service, he carried a sense of restlessness that could not be satisfied by civilian life. He was a soldier at his core, but a soldier who required a cause he could truly believe in. He spent a brief period adrift, honing his marksmanship and exploring the rugged terrain of North America, further developing the survival skills that would soon be tested in the Arklay Mountains. He was waiting for a call to action that aligned with his internal code, unaware that the next chapter of his life would involve a conspiracy so vast it would span decades and continents. The transition from a disgraced Air Force pilot to a member of Raccoon City's elite Special Tactics and Rescue Service was facilitated by a man who saw the potential beneath the rebellion. Barry Burton, a veteran with a keen eye for talent and a friend of the Redfield family, recognized that Chris possessed exactly the kind of iron will and precision that the newly formed Alpha team required. Barry didn't just recruit Chris for his ability to hit a bullseye from 500 yards. He recruited him because he knew Chris was a man of character who would never abandon a partner in the field. Joining S.T.A.R.S Alpha team provided Chris with the structure he had missed since leaving the military, but with a more localized, community-focused mission. He was brought in as the team's lead marksman and a backup pilot, roles that allowed him to utilize his specific expertise while integrating into a small, tight-knit unit. In those early days in Raccoon City, Chris found a sense of belonging that had eluded him. He was surrounded by experts, chemists, mechanics, and survivalists, all working toward the goal of keeping a growing Midwestern city safe from a rising crime rate. The recruitment was a turning point for the Redfield family as well. With Chris settled in Raccoon City, he was able to provide a sense of stability for his younger sister, Claire, even as he spent his nights patrolling the dark corners of the municipality. The bond between Chris and Barry Burton grew stronger during this time, with Barry acting as a mentor who helped Chris channel his rebellious energy into tactical discipline. Chris respected the S.T.A.R.S hierarchy because it felt earned, and he trusted his teammates because he saw their competence and their dedication to the people of Raccoon City every single day. However, the S.T.A.R.S Alpha team was a product of its time, funded in large part by the Umbrella Corporation under the guise of civic philanthropy. Chris, ever the skeptic of large institutions, initially viewed the corporate sponsorship as a necessary evil that provided the team with the best equipment and training available. He didn't yet realize that the very organization paying his salary was the one he would eventually dedicate his life to destroying. At this stage, Chris Redfield was a man who believed in the law and the power of a good team to uphold it. A far cry from the cynical, weary operative he would become. The training Chris underwent during his early S.T.A.R.S years was grueling and comprehensive. He was introduced to urban pacification, high-stakes hostage negotiation, and advanced wilderness survival, all of which refined his natural talents into a professional edge. He became a fixture of the Raccoon City Police Department, a man known for his quiet intensity and his absolute reliability in the field. He was the anchor of Alpha Team, the marksman who never missed, and the teammate who never flinched. The recruitment was a success, and for a short time, Chris Redfield believed he had finally found his place in the world. The partnership between Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine is perhaps the most significant relationship in the history of biological warfare. From their earliest days on Alpha Team, they were designated as the point and the backup, a tactical arrangement that required an absolute, intuitive level of trust. While Chris provided the raw power and the long-range precision, Jill brought a level of finesse, lock-picking expertise, and environmental awareness that balanced his more direct approach. They didn't just work together. They learned to think as a single unit, anticipating each other's movements before a word was ever spoken. Their trust was not forged in the supernatural horror of the Spencer Mansion, but in the gritty, high-crime reality of Raccoon City in the mid-1990s. Before the T-virus was ever a factor, Chris and Jill were dealing with the fallout of a city struggling with rapid industrialization and organized crime. They navigated dark alleys and responded to violent calls together, building a foundation of mutual respect that was based on competence and shared danger. Chris saw in Jill a person who was just as dedicated to the mission as he was, and Jill saw in Chris a man whose loyalty was a physical shield she could stand behind. The early partnership was characterized by a healthy, professional rivalry. They frequently competed in marksmanship contests and tactical drills, pushing each other to be faster, sharper, and more resilient. This competition wasn't about ego. It was about ensuring that when the time came to face a real threat, neither of them would be the weak link. This period of their lives was the last time Chris would feel a sense of uncomplicated camaraderie. They were two highly skilled professionals who believed they were doing the right thing for a city they cared about, unaware of the shadow looming over the Arklay Mountains. Jill was one of the few people who could truly handle Chris's stubbornness. She knew when to push him and when to let him lead, creating a dynamic that allowed them to survive situations that would have broken other teams. Their relationship was built on a series of small, shared moments, cups of coffee in the precinct at 3 a.m, the quiet tension of a stakeout, and the unspoken relief when a mission was completed without casualties. This early trust was the point zero of their history, a bond so strong that it would survive brainwashing, physical transformation, and decades of global trauma. By the time July 1998 arrived, the bond between Chris and Jill was the strongest asset Alpha Team possessed. They were the heart of the unit, a duo that represented the absolute peak of S.T.A.R.S operational capability. When they boarded the helicopter for the Arklay Mountains, they didn't do so as mere co-workers. They did so as the two halves of a singular tactical soul. Chris knew that as long as Jill was at his back, there was nothing they couldn't handle. This belief would be the only thing that kept him sane in the nights to come, as the world they knew began to melt away into a nightmare of blood and bone. Part 4. The Arklay Mountains Deployment. The mission that would forever change the trajectory of Chris Redfield's life began on the night of July the 24th, 1998. Following the mysterious disappearance of Bravo Team during their investigation of bizarre, cannibalistic murders in the Arklay Forest, Alpha Team was deployed to conduct a search and rescue operation. From the moment the helicopter hovered over the dense black canopy of the mountains, Chris felt a sense of wrongness that his military training could not categorize. The air was thick with a preternatural stillness, broken only by the mechanical roar of the engines. When they discovered the wreckage of the Bravo Team helicopter, smoke still curling from the engine block, the reality of the situation began to set in. Finding the empty, blood-spattered cockpit of his colleague's aircraft was the catalyst for the survivor guilt that would define Chris's career. He stood over the charred remains of the mission, looking for signs of life and finding only the severed hand of the pilot, Kevin Dooley. It was a visceral, sudden introduction to a level of violence that S.T.A.R.S had never encountered. Before he could even process the loss of his friends, the forest itself seemed to turn against them. The sight of a pack of skinless, mutated dogs emerging from the undergrowth, was the first time Chris witnessed the biological perversion of nature. The retreat to the nearby estate was not a tactical choice, but a desperate flight for survival. As they ran through the dark woods, chased by the sound of snapping jaws and wet thuds, Chris realized that the mission parameters had been a lie. They were not rescuers. They were prey. The transition from a professional operative to a hunted animal happened in the span of a few minutes. By the time they reached the heavy oak doors of the Spencer mansion, the team was fractured, and the forest had claimed their pilot, Joseph Frost. Chris was forced to witness a teammate being torn apart before his eyes, a memory that would play on a loop in his mind for decades. This deployment marked the end of Chris Redfield, the civilian officer, and the birth of Chris Redfield, the survivor. The Arklay Mountains were no longer just a geographical location on a map. They were a graveyard for the idealism of Alpha Team. Chris realized that the rules he had followed his entire life, the chain of command, the law, the logic of physics, no longer applied. He stood in the grand hall of the mansion, his heart hammering against his ribs, clutching his Beretta, and realizing that the only thing that mattered was the person standing next to him. The weight of the missing Bravo team members pressed heavily on his conscience. He felt a personal responsibility to find Enrico Marini, Rebecca Chambers, and the others, a drive that pushed him deeper into the dark corridors of the estate. He wasn't just fighting for his own life. He was fighting to justify the lives that had already been lost in the forest. This was the moment Chris began to harden his exterior, a process of emotional calcification that was necessary to endure the horrors that were waiting behind every door of the Spencer mansion. Part 5. The Spencer Mansion. The Spencer Mansion was more than just a house. It was a labyrinth of intentional cruelty designed by George Trevor and commissioned by Oswell E. Spencer. As Chris moved through the wood-paneled hallways and marble-floored galleries, he began to see the architecture of a conspiracy. This was his first exposure to the concept of a bioweapon, not as a theoretical threat, but as a deliberate product of human greed. The zombies he encountered were not the result of a supernatural curse, but the victims of a clinical, calculated infection known as the T virus. This realization shifted the horror from the realm of the impossible to the realm of the industrial. Every room in the mansion was a test of his physical and mental fortitude. Chris encountered biological abominations like the Hunter Alpha and the giant spider, creatures that were clearly engineered for combat. He realized that the mansion was a giant laboratory disguised as a residence, a place where the lives of the innocent were traded for scientific data. The sight of researchers who had turned into monsters, still wearing their white lab coats, was a grim reminder of the fate that awaited anyone who worked for Umbrella. Chris didn't just see enemies. He saw the end result of a company that viewed human beings as disposable resources. The mansion's puzzles and traps forced Chris to think under extreme duress, further refining the mechanical and analytical skills he had developed in the Air Force. He was no longer just a soldier. He was an investigator, piecing together the history of the Trevor family and the origin of the progenitor virus. The environmental storytelling of the mansion, the journals of the dying, the hidden passages, and the biological experiments in the shark tanks painted a picture of a corporation that operated entirely outside the bounds of human morality. Chris began to understand that Umbrella was not just a company. It was a cancer. His interactions with the surviving members of Bravo Team, particularly the young medic Rebecca Chambers, highlighted his natural protective instincts. Despite the chaos, Chris took on the role of a mentor and a shield. such as ensuring that Rebecca could navigate the horrors of the estate. This reinforced his identity as a protector, but it also increased the psychological pressure he felt. Every person he helped was another person he could potentially lose. The mansion was a factory of grief, and Chris was the one collecting the bill. By the time he reached the lower laboratories, Chris had undergone a fundamental shift in perspective. He no longer saw the world in terms of right and wrong, but in terms of living an umbrella. The mansion had stripped away his faith in the safety of the modern world. He realized that beneath the surface of civilization, there were men like Spencer who were willing to burn everything for the sake of evolution. This was the true exposure, not just to a virus, but to the dark heart of the 20th century's corporate obsession. Part 6. Wesker's Betrayal. The discovery that Albert Wesker, the captain of Alpha Team, and the man Chris had trusted with his life, was actually an umbrella mole, was the moment Chris's fundamental trust in authority was permanently destroyed. In the cold, sterile light of the underground laboratory, Wesker revealed himself as the architect of the S.T.A.R.S team's destruction. He had led his own men into a death trap to collect combat data on Umbrella's biological weapons. For Chris, this was a betrayal that went deeper than a simple breach of duty. It was a violation of the soldier's code that he held sacred. Wesker's cold, detached explanation of his motives revealed a level of sociopathy that Chris could barely comprehend. To Wesker, the members of S.T.A.R.S, men Chris had laughed with, trained with, and bled with, were nothing more than test subjects. This revelation turned Chris's grief into a white-hot, focused rage. He realized that the man he had looked up to as a leader was the very person responsible for the screams he had heard in the forest. The betrayal was total, encompassing the past, the present, and the future of the S.T.A.R.S program. The confrontation reached its peak when Wesker released the tyrant T-002, the ultimate biological weapon to kill Chris and Jill. Seeing the monster emerge from its stasis tank was the physical manifestation of Wesker's hubris. Chris stood his ground against a creature designed to be the pinnacle of combat evolution, driven by a refusal to let Wesker's treachery go unpunished. In that moment, the rivalry that would span more than a decade was born. Chris didn't just want to survive. He wanted to prove that the human spirit and tactical discipline were stronger than any manufactured monster. Wesker's apparent death at the hands of the tyrant provided a momentary sense of justice, but the damage was already done. The internal hierarchy of Chris's world had collapsed. If the man at the top of the most elite police unit in the country was a murderer and a spy, then no institution could be trusted. This realization turned Chris into a permanent outsider. He would spend the rest of his life looking at authority figures with suspicion, always waiting for the moment the mask would slip to reveal the corporate logo underneath. The betrayal also served to bind Chris and Jill Valentine even closer together. They were the only ones who knew the full extent of Wesker's crimes, and they were the only ones left to carry the burden of the truth. As they fought their way out of the collapsing laboratory, Chris made a silent vow that he would never again let a man like Wesker operate in the shadows. The captain's sunglasses were no longer a sign of authority, but a symbol of the lies that had nearly cost them everything. The mission was no longer about rescue, it was about revenge. Part 7. Escape and Aftermath. The escape from the Spencer mansion was a desperate race against a self-destruct timer, a sequence that mirrored the ticking clock of Chris's own sanity. Standing on the rooftop helipad, facing down the mutated tyrant as the mansion burned below them, Chris felt the full weight of the night's casualties. Forrest Speyer, Richard Aiken, Enrico Marini, names of good men who had been reduced to statistics in Wesker's ledger. When Brad Vickers finally arrived with the helicopter and dropped the rocket launcher, Chris fired the final shot not just to save himself, but to end the nightmare that Umbrella had birthed in the mountains. As the helicopter pulled away and the mansion vanished in a massive fireball, the silence that followed was not one of peace. Looking down at the smoking crater that used to be the Arklay estate, Chris felt a profound sense of survivor guilt. He had made it out, but he had left the bodies of his friends behind in the ash. The sunrise over Raccoon City felt hollow. While the rest of the world was waking up to a normal Monday morning, Chris and Jill were carrying the weight of a secret that the world wasn't ready to hear. The aftermath in Raccoon City was perhaps more frustrating than the mansion itself. When Chris and the other survivors attempted to report Wesker's betrayal and Umbrella's illegal biological research to the police department and the city government, they were met with a wall of bureaucratic silence. Chief Brian Irons, himself a pawn of Umbrella, worked to discredit the S.T.A.R.S survivors, portraying them as traumatized officers who had suffered a collective breakdown in the woods. Chris found himself in a world where the monsters were real, but the law refused to see them. This institutional gaslighting pushed Chris to a breaking point. He realized that he could not fight Umbrella from within the system. The obsessive goal that would drive him for the next several years took root here: the total destruction of the Umbrella Corporation. He began to distance himself from his life in Raccoon City, including his sister Claire, in an attempt to protect her from the shadows he was about to enter. He became a man possessed, a rogue operative who spent his nights compiling evidence and his days training for a war that no one else believed was happening. The mansion incident was the end of Chris Redfield's youth. He left the forest as a man who had seen the abyss and realized that the abyss had a corporate headquarters. The survivor guilt didn't weaken him, it fueled him. He refused to let the deaths of his teammates be in vain. If the law wouldn't hold Umbrella accountable, then he would. He packed his bags, left his badge behind, and vanished into the European underground, becoming a ghost in pursuit of the men who had turned the Arklay Mountains into a slaughterhouse. Part 8. Investigating Umbrella Alone. While Jill Valentine remained in Raccoon City to keep a close watch on Umbrella's local movements, Chris took a more aggressive, global approach. He realized that the Raccoon City facility was just one limb of a much larger organism, and to kill it, he had to go to the heart of the beast in Europe. Operating as a rogue agent without the protection of a badge or a government agency, Chris began a lonely, dangerous investigation into Umbrella's primary headquarters and its various shell companies. This was the period where Chris transitioned from a police officer to a true international operative, learning to navigate the world of black markets, corporate espionage, and illegal arms dealing. His investigation was fueled by a singular burning obsession that left little room for a personal life. He spent months traveling through the European underground, following paper trails and digital breadcrumbs that led to secret laboratories and holding facilities. He lived out of motels and safe houses, his only companions being the files he had stolen from the S.T.A.R.S office and the memories of his fallen teammates. This isolation began to warp his perspective. He saw the Umbrella logo everywhere, a hidden enemy that was woven into the very fabric of global commerce. He was a man on the outside looking in, a whistleblower with a gun. Chris's solo mission was a testament to his sheer force of will. Without a team to back him up, he had to be his own pilot, his own mechanic, and his own intel officer. He utilized the skills he had learned in the Air Force to bypass security systems and infiltrate high-security zones. However, this period also marked the beginning of his emotional detachment. He stopped calling Claire, fearing that Umbrella's reach would extend to his family if they knew he was still active. This self-imposed exile was meant to be a shield, but it created a rift of silence that would eventually lead to the next great tragedy in his life. The difficulty of working alone nearly broke him on several occasions. He was hunted by Umbrella's private security forces and professional assassins, men who were just as skilled as he was, but lacked his moral constraints. Every narrow escape reinforced his belief that Umbrella was an existential threat to humanity. He realized that they weren't just making weapons, they were trying to rewrite the laws of biology. The documents he found, blueprints for V-complexes and Antarctic bases, showed a company that was preparing for a world after civilization. By the time late 1998 arrived, Chris had gathered enough intelligence to realize that Umbrella was preparing for something massive. However, his focus was abruptly shifted when he received word through the underground network that his sister, Claire, had gone looking for him in Raccoon City and had disappeared. The guilt of his silence hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had tried to protect her by staying away, but his obsession had led her directly into the path of the very monster he was trying to slay. The mission to destroy Umbrella was momentarily sidelined by the only thing that mattered more: family. Part 9. Claire's disappearance. The news of Claire Redfield's disappearance in the ruins of Raccoon City and her subsequent capture by Umbrella was the ultimate failure in Chris's eyes. He had left her behind to keep her safe, believing that a clean break would insulate her from the fallout of the S.T.A.R.S investigation. Instead, his silence had driven her to investigate on her own, leading her into the heart of a viral outbreak that had leveled an entire city. When he received the distress call from Leon S. Kennedy, a man he had never met, informing him that Claire was being held at a remote island prison, Chris's world narrowed down to a single objective: Rockfort Island. The guilt Chris felt was compounded by the realization that Claire had become a survivor in her own right. While he was playing spy in Europe, his little sister had been fighting through a city of zombies and G-mutants. This shifted the dynamic of their relationship. He no longer viewed her as someone who needed to be shielded from the truth, but as someone who had been baptized in the same fire that had forged him. However, the protective instinct remained. He could live with the death of his teammates, but he could not live with the loss of the only family he had left. The journey to Rockfort Island was a frantic, high-stakes operation. Chris had to use every contact and every ounce of resources he had gathered in Europe to secure a way onto the private Umbrella territory. He was no longer working with the calculated patience of an investigator. He was a brother on a warpath. This mission showed the all-or-nothing nature of Chris's loyalty. He was willing to charge into the mouth of the beast, alone and outgunned, if it meant there was even a slight chance of pulling Claire out of the dark. This period also highlighted the evolution of the biological threat. Through his journey to save Claire, Chris learned about the T. veronica virus, a far more sophisticated and stable strain than the one he had encountered in the mansion. He realized that while he was hunting the old Umbrella, the company was already evolving into something new and even more terrifying. The stakes had been raised from a local outbreak to a global genetic arms race. Claire was the catalyst that brought Chris back into the fight, but the eland would provide the proof that the war was just beginning. The emotional stakes of Claire's disappearance served to harden Chris even further. He realized that as long as Umbrella existed, no one he loved would ever be safe. The rebellious streak of his Air Force days had matured into a revolutionary fervor. He wasn't just a soldier fighting a battle. He was a man fighting to reclaim his life from a corporation that had stolen his past and was threatening his future. He landed on the shores of Rockfort Island, not just as a S.T.A.R.S survivor, but as a Redfield, and for the first time in months, the lone wolf had a reason to howl. Part 10. Rockfort Island. Rockfort Island was a grim reflection of the Spencer Mansion, but on a much larger, more militarized scale. As Chris infiltrated the facility in December 1998, he was struck by the sheer coldness of the architecture. This was a prison and an experimental ground, a place where the Ashford family practiced a form of aristocratic madness that made Spencer look almost sane. Chris had to navigate a landscape of high-tech security systems, gulp worms and bandersnatches, creatures that showed the horrifying diversity of Umbrella's research. The island was a testament to the fact that the T-virus was just the beginning of a much larger plan for human restructuring. The infiltration of the island was Chris's first major operation as a super soldier archetype. He moved with a level of confidence and lethality that surpassed his time on Alpha Team. However, he soon realized that he was walking into a trap set by an old ghost. The presence of Albert Wesker on the island, very much alive and possessing superhuman abilities, was a shock that nearly cost Chris his life. This was the moment Chris realized that the rules of human combat had been permanently rewritten. Wesker was no longer just a traitor. He was a god in the making, and Chris was still just a man. The physical gap between Chris and Wesker was revealed in a brutal, one-sided confrontation in the island's laboratory. Wesker easily overpowered Chris, his movements too fast for the human eye to follow, and his strength capable of shattering concrete. This humiliation was a pivotal moment in Chris's psychological development. He realized that to protect Claire and destroy Umbrella, he could no longer rely on traditional military training alone. He needed to push his body to the absolute limit of human capability. This encounter is the reason Chris spent the next several years in a state of hyper-intensive physical training, transforming himself into the powerhouse seen in later years. Despite the presence of Wesker, Chris's primary focus remained on Claire. The reunion between the siblings amidst the ruins of the island was one of the few moments of genuine warmth in his long, dark history. Seeing Claire alive and fighting alongside him validated his belief in the Redfield bloodline. Together, they navigated the escalating madness of Alexia Ashford's awakening and the eventual destruction of the facility. Rockfort Island taught Chris that the threat was not just corporate, it was familial, driven by the twisted legacies of the founders of Umbrella. The island also served as the bridge to the Antarctic base, expanding the scope of the conflict to the literal ends of the Earth. Chris followed the trail of the Ashfords and Wesker to the frozen south, a journey that symbolized his willingness to go anywhere to finish the job. Rockfort Island was the end of the Raccoon City era for Chris. He emerged from the conflict with the realization that the war against bioterrorism would require more than just bravery. It would require a global organization and a level of personal sacrifice that he was only beginning to understand. The encounter on Rockfort Island was the moment Chris Redfield realized that the man he once called Captain had transcended humanity to become something demonic. When Albert Wesker stepped out of the shadows, his eyes glowing a predatory gold behind his signature sunglasses. The physical power gap between the two men was laid bare in a way that was nearly fatal for Chris. Wesker did not just fight. He moved with a flickering, supernatural speed that made Chris's elite S.T.A.R.S training look like the clumsy flailing of a child. Every punch Chris threw was caught or dodged with a mocking ease, and every strike Wesker landed felt like being hit by a high-speed vehicle. This was not a battle of peers. It was a predator toying with its prey. The psychological humiliation of this defeat was more profound than the physical trauma. Wesker used the opportunity to taunt Chris about his inability to protect his teammates and his sister, weaponizing the survivor guilt that already plagued Chris's mind. Being pinned against a wall by a single hand, gasping for air, while Wesker laughed at his human limitations, forced a radical shift in Chris's worldview. He realized that if he was going to stand any chance of stopping the biological tide, he could no longer be just a highly trained officer. He had to become a physical juggernaut, a man whose sheer strength could bridge the gap created by viral enhancement. This confrontation set the stage for the legendary physical transformation Chris would undergo over the next several years. He became obsessed with heavy resistance training and tactical conditioning, pushing his body toward a massive muscular frame designed to absorb and dish out incredible amounts of force. He wasn't just working out. He was building a biological armor of his own. The image of Wesker throwing him through a reinforced wall was burned into his memory, serving as the primary motivation for every hour he spent in the gym and every grueling survival course he completed. He was preparing for a rematch that he knew was inevitable. Beyond the physical, this meeting revealed that Wesker was now working for a third organization, proving that the threat had survived the collapse of Umbrella's Raccoon City assets. Chris understood then that the death of a corporation would not be enough. The science was out in the wild, and men like Wesker were the new gods of a world where DNA was a weapon. The rivalry between them was no longer just about the S.T.A.R.S betrayal. It was a fundamental clash between human grit and viral arrogance. Chris walked away from that encounter with a bruised body but a sharpened focus, knowing that his old life was truly dead. The only reason Chris survived the island was the chaotic interference caused by the facility's self-destruct sequence and the awakening of Alexia Ashford. Wesker's arrogance led him to leave Chris to die in the fire, a mistake the villain would live to regret. As Chris boarded the escape plane with Claire, he didn't look back at the exploding island with relief. He looked forward, his eyes fixed on a horizon where Wesker was still waiting. The confrontation had stripped away the last of Chris's illusions, leaving behind a man who was ready to become whatever the mission required him to be. Part 12. Antarctica and the Tyrant Legacy. The chase led Chris from the tropical heat of Rockfort to the frozen desolation of the Antarctic transport terminal, a place that symbolized the cold, unyielding nature of the Ashford family legacy. In the sub-zero temperatures of the base, Chris was forced to contend with the T. veronica virus, a strain that utilized the social hierarchy of ants to create a collective hive mind intelligence. This was a terrifying evolution of the tyrant legacy he had encountered in the mansion. He saw the way the virus could be used to rewrite the social order of humanity, creating a world where a single queen, like Alexia Ashford, could rule over a mindless, mutated brood. Navigating the ice and the steel of the Antarctic base, Chris witnessed the tragic end of Steve Burnside, a young man who had become a casualty of the virus and the Ashford madness. Seeing Claire's grief over Steve's death reinforced the heavy cost of the war they were fighting. Chris felt the weight of every life lost in his presence, adding Steve's name to the long list of those he could not save. The Antarctic base was a graveyard of ambition, fulfilled with the frozen corpses of researchers and workers who had been discarded by the umbrella hierarchy. It was a stark reminder that to the elites of the company, even their most loyal employees were nothing more than fuel for the fire. The battle against the mutated Alexia Ashford was the ultimate test of Chris's tactical ingenuity. He had to utilize advanced weaponry and environmental traps to overcome a creature that possessed the power of flight and pyrokinesis. This fight solidified his role as a giant slayer, a man capable of bringing down the most advanced biological weapons through sheer persistence and a refusal to die. When he finally destroyed the T. Veronica Queen, he wasn't just killing a monster. He was pruning a branch of Umbrella's twisted family tree. The Antarctic mission proved that the Redfields were the primary obstacle to the company's vision of a viral future. As the base collapsed into the icy sea, Chris and Claire made their final escape. This marked the official end of Umbrella's old world order, but for Chris, it was just the closing of a chapter. He had seen the virus evolve from a shambling corpse in a hallway to a goddess in a frozen wasteland. He knew that the technology was too powerful to simply disappear. The tyrant legacy was no longer confined to a single mansion or a single city. It was a global contagion that required a global response. Chris began to envision a future where he wasn't just reacting to outbreaks, but actively hunting them down across the planet. The flight home from Antarctica was a somber affair. While Claire had found some measure of closure, Chris was already analyzing the data he had gathered. He had survived the mansion, the island, and the ice, but the shadow of Wesker still loomed large. He knew that his sister would never be truly safe as long as the research existed. This was the moment Chris decided to transition from a rogue investigator to a founding pillar of something larger. He needed an army at his back, and he needed the resources of the world to match the resources of the dark. Part 13. Founding the B.S.A.A. Following the final collapse of the Umbrella Corporation in the early 2000s, the world faced a new and terrifying reality. The black market was flooded with biological weapons. Chris Redfield realized that the era of the local police officer was over, and the era of the global counter-terrorist had begun. Alongside Jill Valentine and a handful of other survivors, Chris helped found the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, or B.S.A.A. This organization was designed to be a multinational force that could operate across borders, to contain outbreaks and dismantle the labs of those who sought to profit from Umbrella's lethal legacy. The founding of the B.S.A.A. was a moment of pragmatism for Chris. He understood that to stop a global threat, he had to work within a global framework, even if he still carried a deep-seated distrust of large institutions. He used his legendary status as one of the original S.T.A.R.S survivors to recruit some of the best tactical minds and soldiers in the world. For Chris, the B.S.A.A. was not just an agency, it was a shield for the innocent. He poured his life into the organization, helping to design the training protocols and the tactical gear that would allow human soldiers to go toe-to-toe with biological abominations. As a founding member, Chris initially occupied a role that was part diplomat and part field commander. He had to convince world governments that the threat of bioterrorism was as real as any conventional war. He spent years in meeting rooms and at hearing tables, testifying about the horrors he had seen in the Arklay Mountains and Antarctica. This was perhaps the most difficult period of his life, as he was forced to navigate the very bureaucracies he had spent his youth rebelling against. However, his dedication was fueled by the memory of his fallen teammates. He was building a monument of action to ensure that no city would ever suffer the fate of Raccoon City again. The early days of the B.S.A.A. were focused on cleanup operations, which involved locating and destroying the hidden umbrella facilities that were still scattered across the globe. Chris led many of these missions personally, his presence on the front lines providing a massive boost to morale for the young recruits. He became the face of the organization, the living legend who had stared down the tyrant and lived to tell the tale. However, this fame was a double-edged sword. It made him a primary target for the remnants of Umbrella and the various terrorist groups that were beginning to emerge in the vacuum left by the company's fall. By the mid-2000s, the B.S.A.A. had evolved from a small advisory group into a formidable military force. Chris had successfully transitioned from a survivor to a soldier, but the transition came at a cost. His life was now entirely consumed by the mission. He had no home, no hobbies, and very few friends outside of the Alliance. His relationship with Jill remained the only constant in his life, their partnership serving as the foundation upon which the entire B.S.A.A. was built. They were the veteran anchors of the world's new defense against the dark, prepared to go wherever the next outbreak ignited. Part 14. Training the Next Generation. As the B.S.A.A. grew in size and influence, Chris Redfield took on the mantle of mentor, training the next generation of operatives who would lead the fight against bioterrorism. He was notoriously demanding, pushing his trainees through simulations that were often more dangerous than actual field missions. He didn't do this out of cruelty, but out of a desperate need to ensure they wouldn't end up as names on a memorial wall. He taught them that in this war, there was no room for error and no such thing as a fair fight. He wanted them to be as hardened and as cynical as he was, because he believed that was the only way they would survive. His training style was focused on the point and backup philosophy he had developed with Jill. He stressed the importance of the bond between partners, teaching his students that their life was in the hands of the person standing next to them. He watched over his recruits with a stern, paternal intensity, often remaining silent while they struggled, only to provide a single, devastatingly accurate piece of advice when they reached their breaking point. To the young soldiers of the B.S.A.A., Chris was an intimidating figure, a man of few words whose scars told a story of a world they were only beginning to understand. Despite his hard exterior, Chris cared deeply for his students. He spent his few off hours reviewing their performance data and advocating for better equipment and medical care for the rank and file. He knew that he was training them to be instruments of war, and that many of them would not live to see the end of the conflict. This realization added another layer to his survivor guilt. Every time a young operative was lost in the field, Chris felt a personal failure, as if his training hadn't been enough to save them. He was building an army, but he was also building a list of people he would eventually have to mourn. One of his most promising protégés during this time was a young man who reminded Chris of his younger self, idealistic, brave, and fiercely loyal. This mentorship provided Chris with a rare sense of purpose outside of direct combat. He saw in the new generation the possibility of a world where he could eventually step down. Though deep in his heart, he knew he would never truly leave the trenches. He was molding the B.S.A.A. into a force that could survive without him. even as he became more and more indispensable to its success. Training the next generation also forced Chris to confront his own aging and the toll the war was taking on his body. He saw the speed and the energy of the young recruits and realized that he had to work twice as hard to maintain his edge. This only intensified his physical training regimen, leading to the massive, powerhouse physique that would become his trademark in the field. He refused to be the veteran who sat in the back of the room. He would lead from the front, proving to his students that a human being could still be the most dangerous thing on the battlefield, even in an age of biological gods. Part 15. Sheva, Alomar, and Kijuju. In March 2009, Chris Redfield was deployed to the Kijuju Autonomous Zone in Africa to investigate reports of a new biological threat. It was here that he was partnered with Sheva Alomar, an operative from the B.S.A.A. West African branch. The partnership was initially a pragmatic one. Chris needed a local guide who understood the terrain and the culture, and Sheva needed the tactical expertise of a legendary founder. However, as they moved into the sun-drenched streets of Kijuju and were greeted by the sight of the Majini, civilians who had been forcibly infected with the Type 2 plaga, their bond was forged in blood. The Kijuju mission was a radical departure from the dark, claustrophobic corridors of the Spencer Mansion. Under the blinding African sun, Chris faced a level of aggression and coordination that the old Umbrella zombies could never match. The Majini were fast, they used tools, and they worked together as a cohesive unit. This forced Chris to adapt his tactics on the fly, relying heavily on Sheva's agility and local knowledge. Their partnership quickly evolved from professional cooperation to a deep, unspoken trust. Sheva became the backup to Chris's point, her presence reminding him of the importance of why he fought. As they dug deeper into the conspiracy, Chris discovered that Kijuju was the testing ground for the Uroboros project, a plan for global selection orchestrated by Wesker and the Tri-Cell Corporation. This mission was deeply personal for Chris, as he also found clues that Jill Valentine, long thought dead after a confrontation with Wesker years prior, might still be alive. The mission became a desperate race against time, with Chris balancing his duty to stop Uroboros with his obsession to find his lost partner. Sheva stayed by his side through every horror, proving to be one of the few people who could truly stand equal to the legend of Chris Redfield. The Kijuju environment was a visceral reminder of the human cost of bioterrorism. Chris saw entire villages decimated and transformed into mindless thralls for a corporate agenda. This reinforced his soldier mindset. The mission had to come before the man, because the stakes were nothing less than the survival of the human race. He moved through the marshes and the ancient ruins with a relentless driving force, his massive frame a symbol of human resistance against the viral tide. He was no longer just a cop. He was a global operative dismantling a god complex. By the time they reached the heart of the Tri-Cell facility, the partnership between Chris and Sheva was unbreakable. She had seen him at his most vulnerable and his most ferocious, and she had never wavered. For Chris, Sheva was a reminder that the world was still full of good people worth fighting for. Together, they represented the best of the B.S.A.A., two individuals from different worlds, united by a singular goal of stopping the nightmare. Kijuju was the ultimate test of Chris's new, hardened self, and Sheva Alomar was the partner who ensured he didn't lose his humanity in the process. Part 16. The Uroboros Project. The Uroboros project represented the absolute peak of Albert Wesker's madness. Unlike the previous viruses that sought to create monsters or weapons, Uroboros was designed to be a tool of artificial evolution. It was a black, oily mass of organic tentacles that would select those with superior DNA to become a new race of gods, while consuming and destroying the unworthy. For Chris Redfield, this was the ultimate expression of the corporate arrogance he had been fighting since 1998. It was the belief that a few individuals had the right to decide the fate of billions through the medium of a test tube. Stopping Uroboros required Chris to face some of the most grotesque and powerful biological abominations he had ever encountered. The virus was highly unstable, often turning its hosts into massive, shifting piles of black sludge that could consume entire buildings. Chris had to use everything from satellite laser strikes to flamethrowers to combat the infection. Each encounter with Uroboros was a desperate struggle for survival, a reminder that the biological threat was no longer just about monsters, but about a fundamental restructuring of life itself. The sight of the virus absorbing human beings was a nightmare that Chris would carry for the rest of his life. The project was backed by the Tri-Cell Corporation, the successor to Umbrella's legacy of greed. Chris saw that even with Umbrella gone, the blueprint for catastrophe remained. Tri-Cell had taken the research and expanded it, using their vast global resources to hide their experiments in the heart of Africa. This realization solidified Chris's belief that the B.S.A.A. could never truly stop. As long as there was profit to be made from death, someone would be there to sell it. Uroboros was just the latest brand name for the same old evil, and Chris was the only man with the experience and the will to stop it. The final phase of the Uroboros project involved the atmospheric dispersal of the virus, a plan that would have resulted in the death of millions. Chris and Sheva had to infiltrate Wesker's massive stealth bomber, fighting their way through legions of infected and experimental weapons to reach the cockpit. This was the high stakes, world-ending scenario that Chris had been training for since the founding of the B.S.A.A. He moved with a cold, surgical efficiency, his mind focused entirely on the objective. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. He was the final line of defense for a planet that didn't even know it was in danger. Uroboros was the mirror image of Chris's own journey. While the virus sought to create superior beings through genetic manipulation, Chris had forged himself into a superior soldier through sheer human effort and sacrifice. The project was a rejection of the human spirit, and Chris's mission was to prove that the unworthy were the ones who were truly strong. As he fought through the black tentacles of the virus, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for the right of every human being to exist without being judged by a laboratory. Part 17. The Final Battle with Wesker. The long, bloody rivalry between Chris Redfield and Albert Wesker reached its explosive conclusion in the heart of an active volcano. After the plane crashed into the caldera, Wesker, now fully infected with the Uroboros virus, became a towering, tentacled engine of destruction. The battle was a primal clash that transcended modern warfare. It was two men who had defined each other's lives for over a decade, finally settled in a landscape of fire and stone. Chris had to use his sheer physical strength to move massive boulders and create a path for Sheva. His years of intensive training finally paying off in the most literal sense possible. The fight was a testament to Chris's growth as a combatant. He was no longer the panicked rookie in the mansion. He was a warrior who understood his enemy's every move. He exploited Wesker's arrogance and the instability of the Uroboros infection, using a combination of heavy ordnance and hand-to-hand combat to wear down the god. The tension of the battle was suffocating, the heat of the lava a constant threat to their survival. For Chris, this was the culmination of every name on his list, every death he had witnessed, and every betrayal he had suffered. He was the executioner of a ghost that had haunted him for 11 years. The final moment of the battle saw Chris and Sheva hanging from the edge of a B.S.A.A. rescue helicopter, while Wesker, consumed by the lava and the virus, attempted one last act of spite. In a synchronized movement that spoke to their perfect partnership, Chris and Sheva fired a pair of RPG rounds directly into Wesker's head. The resulting explosion finally ended the threat of Albert Wesker, his body dissolving into the magma. As the helicopter pulled away from the erupting volcano, Chris watched the sight of his nightmare vanish into the smoke. He was finally free from the man who had destroyed his life in 1998. However, the victory felt surprisingly hollow. As Chris looked out over the African landscape, he realized that killing Wesker didn't bring back Forrest Speyer, or Enrico Marini, or the thousands of people who had died in Raccoon City. The nemesis was gone, but the world was still broken. The final battle was a physical triumph, but a psychological plateau. He had achieved his singular goal of revenge, only to find that the war against bioterrorism was a hydra that would simply grow another head. The closure he had sought for over a decade was a fleeting sensation, replaced almost immediately by the weight of the future. This battle also marked the return of Jill Valentine to the side of the living. Having saved her from Wesker's control earlier in the mission, Chris felt a profound sense of relief that outweighed the death of his enemy. The point and the backup were reunited, but they were both forever changed. They stood in the doorway of the helicopter, survivors once again, watching the world continue to turn. The final battle with Wesker was the end of the first great era of Chris Redfield's life, and as the adrenaline faded, he began to realize that the hardest part of being a soldier is what happens when you run out of enemies. Part 18. The Cost of Revenge. In the weeks following the Kijuju incident, Chris Redfield found himself in a state of quiet, reflective mourning. He had achieved the impossible. He had killed the man who had haunted the world's nightmares, and he had saved his partner from a fate worse than death. But the cost of this revenge was written across his face and his soul. He was a man who had been driven by a singular purpose for so long that he didn't know how to exist without it. The war had become his personality, and the end of Wesker left him adrift in a world that suddenly felt too quiet. He had victory, but he did not have peace. The psychological toll of the mission was immense. Chris suffered from a persistent sense of displacement, a feeling that he had outlived his own story. He watched Jill Valentine enter a long, difficult recovery process, her body and mind scarred by years of Wesker's chemical and psychological torture. This added a new layer to his survivor guilt. He had saved her, but he couldn't take away the trauma of what she had endured. He realized that even in victory, the virus always left a permanent mark. Revenge had not purified the past. It had only added more blood to the ledger. Chris also faced a growing sense of isolation within the B.S.A.A. To the younger operatives, he was now more than a legend. He was a mythic figure who had killed a god in a volcano. This made it even harder for him to connect with the people he led. He became a man who lived in his own shadow, forever defined by the events of March 2009. He returned to the training grounds, but the fire that had driven his earlier mentorship was now a low, steady burn of obligation. He was a soldier who had forgotten how to be anything else, a man whose only hobby was the preparation for a battle that might never come. The cost of revenge was also physical. The intensive training and the brutal combat had left Chris with a body that was a map of scars and old injuries. He felt the weight of his years every time he moved. A constant reminder that he was a mortal man, fighting a war that was increasingly moving into the realm of the post-human. He began to realize that he was the old guard, a relic of a time when the struggle was between people rather than pathogens. This realization made him even more protective of the young soldiers under his command, leading to the self-sacrificing leadership style that would define his later career. By the time the early 2010s arrived, Chris Redfield was a man of absolute discipline and absolute loneliness. He had closed the wound of 1998, but the scar tissue was thick and inflexible. He was the B.S.A.A's most effective weapon, but he was also its most weary soul. He continued to go on missions, hunting the black market dealers and the small-time bioterrorists, but he was searching for something he would never find, a reason to stop. The cost of revenge was the loss of the man he might have been if he had never stepped foot in the Arklay Mountains. Section 5. Collapse in Resident Evil 6. Part 19. Edonia and the Failed Mission. The year 2012 brought the most devastating defeat of Chris Redfield's life in the war-torn streets of Edonia in Eastern Europe. As a high-ranking B.S.A.A. Alpha Team commander, Chris led a squad of young, idealistic soldiers into a conflict involving the new C virus. Among them was his most trusted protege, Piers Nivans. Chris moved through the battlefield with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to protect his men and contain the outbreak. However, he fell into a trap set by a woman he believed to be Ada Wong, actually a doppelganger named Carla Radames. This mistake would lead to the total annihilation of his squad in a matter of seconds. Chris was forced to watch as his men were injected with the C virus and transformed into grotesque chrysalid mutations right before his eyes. The soldiers who had looked up to him, the men he had trained and promised to protect, were turned into the very monsters they had been sent to fight. The screams of his squad as they mutated were a sound that Chris could not block out. He was knocked unconscious during the chaos, but the psychological damage was done. When he woke up, he was the only survivor besides Piers, and the weight of the failure was more than his mind could bear. The loss of the Edonia squad was the final straw for Chris's fragile psyche. He had survived the mansion, the island, and the volcano, but he could not survive the sight of his own children being butchered because of his tactical error. He was consumed by a sudden, violent amnesia, a psychological defense mechanism that wiped his memory of the event but left the crushing sense of self-hatred intact. He wandered away from the B.S.A.A., abandoning his post, his mission, and his identity. The legendary Chris Redfield vanished, replaced by a broken man lost in the dark corners of Eastern Europe. For months, Chris lived as a ghost in the bars of Edonia, drinking himself into a stupor to escape the feeling of a guilt he couldn't quite remember. He was a shell of a man, his massive physique wasting away and his eyes vacant. He was a soldier who had lost his war and his soul. This was the lowest point in his history, a total collapse of the shield he had built around himself since 1998. The rebellious pilot and the B.S.A.A. legend were gone. leaving only a hollowed-out drunk who was waiting for the world to finally finish him off. This period of amnesia was a physical manifestation of his survivor guilt. He had outlived so many people that his mind finally refused to process any more names. He was a man who had been defined by his memory of the fallen, and when that memory became too heavy, his mind simply shut down. He was a ghost haunting his own life, a reminder that even the strongest human spirit has a breaking point. It would take a monumental effort from the only person who still believed in him to bring the legend back from the edge of the abyss. Part 20. Amnesia and Self-Hatred. During his months as a fugitive from his own life, Chris Redfield existed in a state of primal, unthinking self-hatred. He didn't know who he was, but he knew that he deserved the pain he felt. He spent his days in a fog of cheap alcohol, and his nights in the back alleys of Edonia, getting into senseless bar fights, and seeking out physical punishment as a way to ground himself in reality. He was a man trying to outrun his own shadow, but the shadow was built into his DNA. The amnesia provided a thin veil of protection, but the core of his trauma was always there, vibrating just beneath the surface of his consciousness. The irony of Chris's amnesia was that while he had forgotten the names of his squad, he had not forgotten the feeling of their loss. He was a man mourning a ghost, his body still reacting to the tactical reflexes of a soldier, even as his mind refused to acknowledge the mission. He was a danger to himself and others, a powerhouse of muscle and instinct with no moral or professional anchor. This period was the ultimate point zero of his adult life, a total stripping away of the legend to reveal the wounded human being underneath. He was no longer a hero. He was a casualty of a war that he had tried to win through sheer force of will. When Piers Nivans finally tracked him down in a dingy Edonian bar, the confrontation was a clash between the past and the present. Piers had to force Chris to look at the photos of his fallen squad, dragging the memories back into the light with a brutal, uncompromising honesty. The return of Chris's memory was not a moment of healing, but a moment of absolute agony. The wall of amnesia collapsed, and the reality of the Edonia massacre hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He remembered every face, every scream, and every detail of his failure. The self-hatred that followed was a cold, focused fire. Chris didn't want to return to the B.S.A.A. to save the world. He wanted to return to find Ada Wong and kill her. He was driven by a dark, vengeful obsession that was even more dangerous than his amnesia. He had moved from a broken man to a man of glass, sharp, transparent, and ready to shatter. He agreed to go back to the front lines, but he was no longer the leader, the B.S.A.A. remembered. He was a man looking for a grave, and he was willing to take the entire organization down with him if it meant getting his revenge. This era of Chris's life showed the dark side of his loyalty. His love for his men had turned into a toxic, destructive grief that threatened to consume everyone around him. He treated his new subordinates with a cold, reckless disregard, his only focus being the hunt for the woman who had destroyed his soul. He was a soldier who had lost his way, sheer weapon that had been bent by the weight of its own history. The ghost had returned to the world, but he had brought the darkness of the Edonian bars with him, a reminder that for Chris Redfield, the war was no longer about justice, it was about pain. Part 21. Piers Nivans' loyalty. In the wake of the Edonia disaster, Piers Nivans became the living anchor for Chris Redfield's fractured psyche. Piers was more than just a talented sniper or a dedicated subordinate. He was the physical manifestation of the idealism that Chris had lost in the Arklay Mountains. While Chris was spiraling into a vortex of self-destruction and alcoholic fugue, Piers refused to let the legend die in a gutter. He spent months tracking his commander across Eastern Europe, not out of a sense of military duty, but out of a deep personal conviction that the world still needed the man Chris used to be. Piers saw in Chris the blueprint for the perfect soldier, and he was willing to endure Chris's verbal and physical lashings to pull him back into the light. The loyalty Piers exhibited was a mirror of the young Chris Redfield, who had once rebelled against the Air Force to save his friends, and this created a complex psychological dynamic, where Piers was essentially saving Chris from himself by reminding him of his own code. During the mission in Lanxiang, China, Piers acted as Chris's conscience, constantly challenging his reckless, revenge-driven decisions. He was the only one brave enough to call out the legendary commander for his tactical errors, forcing Chris to realize that his obsession with Ada Wong was putting a new generation of soldiers at risk. Piers was the bridge that allowed Chris to cross back from the realm of the ghost into the realm of the leader. The relationship between the two men was defined by a series of grueling, high-stakes battles, where Piers's support was the only thing keeping Chris alive. Whether it was providing long-range cover fire or physically dragging Chris out of the path of an explosion, Piers proved that the backup role was just as vital as the point. Chris began to see in Piers a worthy successor, a man who possessed the tactical brilliance of a S.T.A.R.S operative and the moral clarity of a founding B.S.A.A member. This realization slowly began to heal the wound of Edonia, as Chris started to invest himself in Piers' future rather than his own past. However, Piers' loyalty came at a high emotional cost for both men. Piers had to witness the degradation of his hero, seeing the cracks in the armor that the rest of the world thought was impenetrable. He carried the burden of Chris's trauma as if it were his own, often putting his own safety second to ensure Chris didn't falter. This unwavering devotion was what eventually forced Chris to regain his focus. He realized that he couldn't keep failing the people who believed in him. Piers Nivans was the catalyst for Chris's resurrection, a reminder that even in a world of biological horrors, human loyalty remained the most powerful force on the battlefield. As they moved toward the heart of the Neo-Umbrella conspiracy, the bond between Chris and Piers reached its absolute peak. They were no longer commander and subordinate. They were partners in the truest sense of the word. Chris had finally accepted the loss of his Edonia squad by vowing to protect the man standing next to him at any cost. He didn't know that the cost of Piers' loyalty would eventually be the ultimate sacrifice. Piers had given Chris back his life, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate as the next name on the long, tragic list of those who died to keep Chris Redfield fighting. Chapter 22. Neo-Umbrella and Ada's Shadow. The hunt for Neo-Umbrella was driven by Chris's belief that he was chasing a ghost from his past. The woman he believed was Ada Wong, the mercenary who had supposedly betrayed the S.T.A.R.S survivors in 1998, became the focal point of his rage. This obsession clouded his judgment, turning a strategic operation into a personal vendetta. Chris pursued Ada through the crowded streets and high-rise buildings of Lanxiang with a tunnel vision that nearly resulted in the loss of his entire new squad. He saw her as the personification of everything that had gone wrong since the Spencer mansion, a shadow that needed to be stepped on once and for all. The conflict was complicated by the interference of Leon S. Kennedy, who was protecting the real Ada Wong. This led to a tense, high-stakes standoff between the two titans of the bioterror war. Chris, fueled by his grief for his Edonia men, was ready to execute Ada on the spot, while Leon argued for her importance as a witness. This confrontation was a clash of philosophies. Chris's mission-first mentality versus Leon's more nuanced, individualistic approach. It was a moment where Chris realized that his moral exhaustion had turned him into a blunt instrument, a man who had forgotten that the truth is often more complex than a target in a crosshair. Discovering that his target was actually Carla Radames, a victim of the C virus and Neo Umbrella's madness, was a devastating blow to Chris's ego. He realized that he had been manipulated into a frenzy by a doppelganger, and that his revenge had been directed at a ghost. The shadow of Ada Wong was a smokescreen that allowed the real threat, the massive biological weapon known as HIOS, to gestate in the depths of an underwater facility. This realization forced Chris to confront his own fallibility. He had let his emotions dictate his tactics, a mistake that a veteran of his caliber should never have made. The Neo Umbrella operation showed the global scale of the threat that Chris had been fighting since his youth. This wasn't just a local outbreak. It was a coordinated attempt to bring about a global ginger, a total restructuring of the world through the C virus. Chris moved through the underwater base with a grim sense of duty, the weight of the impending catastrophe pressing down on him. He was no longer fighting for revenge. He was fighting to stop the clock. The architectural madness of the Neo Umbrella facility mirrored the twisted mind of its creator, Simmons, providing Chris with one last look into the heart of corporate sociopathy. By the time he reached the final levels of the base, Chris was physically and emotionally exhausted. The constant combat and the crushing weight of his failures had left him in a state of terminal weariness. He looked at the world and saw only a recurring cycle of viral evolution and human suffering. The hunt for Ada's shadow had led him to a place where he had to face the ultimate choice. The mission was no longer about winning. It was about preventing a total loss. He stood at the edge of the abyss, ready to do whatever was necessary to ensure that the C virus didn't reach the surface, even if it meant he never saw the sun again. Part 23. Piers' Sacrifice. The final battle against the Haos organism in the depths of the underwater facility was the moment Chris Redfield's life was forever altered by the selfless act of another. When the massive creature pinned Chris down, threatening to end the legend once and for all, Piers Nivans was forced to make a choice that no soldier should ever have to make. Severely injured and realizing he was too weak to save his commander as a human, Piers injected himself with a concentrated dose of the C virus. He traded his humanity for the strength to save the man who had taught him how to be a soldier. Chris watched in horror as his protege underwent an agonizing, lightning-based mutation, the very process Chris had feared most. Piers' sacrifice was a direct rebuke to Chris's self-hatred. By choosing to become a monster to save a hero, Piers proved that Chris's life was still worth saving, even if Chris didn't believe it himself. The mutated Piers used his new electrical powers to blast the Haos away, creating an escape path for his commander. For Chris, this was the ultimate psychological trauma. He had spent years trying to prevent his men from turning into bioweapons, only to have his best student do exactly that to keep him alive. The irony was a jagged blade that cut deep into Chris's soul, she adding Piers' name to the top of his mental memorial wall. As the facility began to collapse around them, Piers realized he could not return to the world of the living. He pushed Chris into the final escape pod, choosing to stay behind and ensure the destruction of the base. The look in Piers' eyes, a mixture of pain, duty, and lingering respect, was the last thing Chris saw before the pod launched. This was not just the loss of a soldier. It was the loss of a son. Piers died so that the old guard could keep fighting. A burden that Chris felt was almost too heavy to carry. He had survived once again, but the price of his life was the soul of the next generation. The escape pod journey to the surface was the longest and loneliest of Chris's life. He sat in the small, cramped space, surrounded by the silence of the ocean, and wept for the boy who had believed in him when no one else did. The sacrifice of Piers Nivans effectively ended Chris's desire for retirement or peace. He realized that he could never stop fighting, because to do so would be to spit on the grave of every person who had died to keep him in the field. Piers had given him his life back for the second time, and Chris understood that he was now a living monument to that sacrifice. When Chris finally reached the surface and was rescued by the B.S.A.A., he was a different man. The rage and the amnesia were gone, replaced by a cold, permanent sense of obligation. He looked at his hand, clutching Piers' B.S.A.A. patch, and felt the weight of 1,000 ghosts. He had outlived another squad, another partner, and another war. The sacrifice in the underwater base was the final forging of the modern Chris Redfield, the man who would spend the rest of his life as a shield, not because he wanted to, but because he was the only one left standing. Part 24. Accepting the role again. After the events in China, Chris Redfield underwent a period of quiet, internal reconstruction. He did not return to the bars of Edonia, nor did he hide from his responsibilities. Instead, he returned to the B.S.A.A. headquarters and accepted his role as a commander with a renewed, almost religious intensity. He chose duty over despair, realizing that his personal pain was secondary to the global need for his experience. He became the eternal soldier, a man who accepted that his life was no longer his own. He was the property of the mission, a human asset that would be used until it finally broke beyond repair. This acceptance was not born of hope, but of a grim, tactical necessity. Chris saw that the world was moving into an era of bioterrorism as the norm, where outbreaks were no longer isolated incidents, but tools of global politics. He realized that the B.S.A.A. needed a figurehead who had seen it all and survived. He stepped back into the training grounds, but his mentorship was now seasoned with a profound, somber wisdom. He spoke less of heroism and more of survival. He wanted his students to understand that the greatest victory was not killing the monster, but ensuring that the person standing next to them made it home. Accepting the role again meant accepting the isolation that came with it. Chris distanced himself from any semblance of a civilian life, dedicating every waking hour to the Alliance. He became a man of routine, training, briefing, deploying, and mourning. He was the most respected man in the organization, but he was also the most alone. He stopped seeking out partnerships that could lead to personal loss, instead surrounding himself with professional teams that operated with mechanical precision. He was the shield, and a shield does not need a personal life. It only needs to be strong enough to take the hit. His reputation during this time was that of a legend who had outlived his own myth. The younger operatives looked at him with a mixture of awe and pity. They saw a man who had won every battle but lost every war of the heart. Chris accepted this status with a quiet dignity. He knew that he was a relic of the 1998 era, a man who still remembered the smell of the S.T.A.R.S office and the sound of Wesker's voice. He was the link between the old world and the new, and he accepted the burden of being the memory of the dead. By the mid-2010s, Chris Redfield had become the ultimate instrument of the B.S.A.A. He was sent to the most dangerous zones, the most contaminated sites, and the most hopeless missions. He accepted them all without question. He was no longer fighting for revenge, or for justice, or even for peace. He was fighting because it was the only thing he knew how to do, and because people like Piers Nivans had died to give him the chance to do it. He had accepted his role as the world's most weary protector, standing guard over a civilization that was slowly forgetting the names of the people who had saved it. Section 6. The Ghost in Resident Evil 7. Part 25. The Umbrella logo reappears. In 2017, the world of Chris Redfield was thrown into a state of profound cognitive dissonance with the emergence of Blue Umbrella. Seeing the blue version of the Umbrella logo, a symbol of a reformed corporation dedicated to cleaning up the mess made by the original Umbrella, was a visceral shock to Chris's system. For a man who had spent his entire adult life trying to erase that logo from the face of the earth, being asked to cooperate with them as a B.S.A.A. observer was a bitter pill. He initially viewed Blue Umbrella with a suspicion that bordered on hostility, convinced that the change in colour was just a fresh coat of paint on an old evil. However, Chris's pragmatism eventually won out over his personal hatred. He realised that Blue Umbrella possessed the most advanced anti-bioweapon technology and data in the world, resources that the B.S.A.A. desperately needed to stay ahead of the evolving threats. He agreed to lead the operation into the Dulvey Bayou in Louisiana, but he did so on his own terms. He was not an employee of Umbrella. He was a watchdog, a ghost moving through their ranks to ensure they stayed on the path of redemption. His presence was a warning. He was the man who had brought down the first Umbrella, and he would not hesitate to destroy the second. Working with Blue Umbrella was a tactical necessity that required Chris to compartmentalize his emotions to an extreme degree. He moved through their mobile command centers with a silent efficiency, his eyes always scanning for any sign of the old corporate greed. He used their specialized weaponry, like the Albert 01 handgun, with a grim irony. He was using the tools of his enemies to protect the innocent, a paradox that defined his new role in the late 2010s. He was the man who had seen the worst of the corporation, and he was the only one qualified to judge their new beginning. The logo's reappearance also signaled a change in the nature of the war. The mold and the E-series bioweapons represented a shift away from viruses toward fungal, mind-controlling organisms. Chris realized that the enemy was no longer just biological, it was psychological. The Baker family incident was a localized horror that had global implications, and Chris's role was to ensure that the blue vision of containment was effective. He acted as the professional anchor in a chaotic, hallucinogenic environment, his grounded military presence providing the only sense of reality in the Dulvey swamp. By the end of the Louisiana operation, Chris had established a tense, working relationship with Blue Umbrella. He still didn't trust them, and he likely never would, but he recognized them as a tool. He had become a man who would use any weapon, no matter the origin, to stop the spread of bioterrorism. The Ghost had returned to the battlefield, not as a commander of a squad, but as a sentinel of the truth. He was the man who remembered the Red Umbrella, and as long as he was alive, the Blue Umbrella would never be allowed to forget it either. Part 26. The Lucas Baker Operation. The hunt for Lucas Baker in the salt mines of Louisiana was a mission that showcased Chris Redfield's evolution into a cold, surgical instrument of war. Unlike his previous missions that often involved large-scale military engagements, the pursuit of Lucas was a cat and mouse game played in the dark, cramped spaces of an abandoned industrial site. Chris operated with a level of efficiency that was almost frightening, his movements precise and his focus unwavering. He was no longer the man who yelled for his teammates or gave emotional speeches. He was a professional who viewed the target as a problem to be solved and the environment as a set of variables to be managed. A Lucas Baker represented the new breed of bioterrorist, the independent contractor, who used viral technology for his own sadistic amusement. Chris saw in Lucas a lack of any ideological or corporate goal, which made him even more dangerous. He was a man who enjoyed the chaos, and Chris treated him with the cold disdain he deserved. Navigating the traps and the molded abominations in the mines, Chris utilized Blue Umbrella's specialized equipment to neutralize threats with a clinical detachment. He was the ghost in the machine, a force of nature that Lucas's twisted games could not break. The operation also highlighted Chris's physical and mental resilience. Despite being in his mid-40s, he moved through the hostile environment with a lethal grace that surpassed his younger years. He had perfected the art of the one shot, one kill, his marksmanship a product of decades of high-stakes combat. He didn't waste energy or emotion on the monsters. He simply erased them. This cold efficiency was a defense mechanism, a way to ensure that he didn't get emotionally invested in a mission that was essentially a cleanup operation for someone else's mess. When he finally cornered and eliminated the mutated Lucas Baker, Chris didn't feel a sense of triumph. He felt a sense of completion. He had neutralized a threat and secured the data, fulfilling his role as the B.S.A.A. observer. He stood in the wreckage of the mines, the blue light of the Umbrella tactical gear reflecting in his eyes, and signaled for extraction. The Lucas Baker operation was a masterpiece of professional soldiering, a demonstration of what Chris Redfield had become, a man who could walk through hell and come out the other side without a single singe on his soul, simply because he had no soul left to burn. This mission solidified Chris's status as a standalone operative who could handle the most sensitive and dangerous assignments. He was the man the B.S.A.A. sent when they couldn't afford a mistake, and the man Blue Umbrella feared because he knew their history. He left Louisiana as a phantom, a soldier who had done his duty and vanished back into the shadows. The ghost was now the primary state of his existence, a man who lived between the lines of the official reports, always watching, always waiting, and always ready to strike. Part 27. Ethan Winters enters the story. The rescue of Ethan Winters from the Baker estate was the moment Chris Redfield became an observer of a new kind of survival. Chris saw in Ethan a civilian who had been thrust into a world of biological horror and had somehow endured through sheer, stubborn love for his wife. To Chris, Ethan was a reminder of the thousands of civilians he hadn't been able to save in Raccoon City and Kijuju. He looked at the battered, traumatized man and felt a strange sense of distance. Ethan was the normal person that Chris had forgotten how to be, a man whose motivations were entirely personal rather than professional. Chris's initial interaction with Ethan was brief and clinical. He secured the area, provided medical assistance, and ensured that Ethan and Mia were taken into protective custody. He didn't offer words of comfort or explanations. He simply performed his duty as the tactical lead. However, as Chris kept a close eye on the Winters family in the years that followed, he felt a silent responsibility for their safety. perhaps as a way to atone for the names on his memorial wall. He was the guardian in the shadows, the man who ensured that the life Ethan had fought so hard to reclaim remained undisturbed. As he observed Ethan's recovery, Chris began to see the long-term effects of the mold infection. He knew that Ethan and his newborn daughter, Rosemary, were now biological anomalies, people who carried the legacy of the E-series within them. This made them targets for every bioterrorist organization and government agency on the planet. Chris's role as their protector became increasingly complex, requiring him to operate in a grey area between the BSAA's oversight and his own personal ethics. He was the ghost watching over a family that didn't even know they were still in danger. The presence of Ethan Winters in the story forced Chris to reflect on the difference between a soldier and a survivor. Chris had chosen to be a soldier, to dedicate his life to the war. Ethan had simply wanted to survive. This contrast highlighted the tragedy of Chris's own life. He had lost the ability to live for anything other than the mission. He watched Ethan and Moya from afar, a man who could never enter their world of domesticity. He was the sentinel at the gate, the one who stood in the cold so that they could stay warm. By the time the events of Resident Evil Village began to unfold, Chris's observation of the Winters family had become his primary focus. He saw the growing threat of Mother Miranda and the Megamycete, and he realized that the peaceful life Ethan had built was a fragile illusion. Chris's decision to intervene was born of a desperate need to prevent another Raccoon City, and he would become the villain in Ethan's story if it meant keeping the world safe from the mold. The entrance of Ethan Winters into Chris's life was the final trigger for the most controversial and isolating phase of Chris Redfield's long career. Part 28. The Death of Mia. The opening moments of the Winters ordeal in Europe saw Chris Redfield take a shocking and seemingly monstrous action: the apparent execution of Mia Winters in front of her husband and child. Chris entered the house with the cold, surgical efficiency of a hit squad, firing multiple rounds into Mia without a word of explanation. To Ethan and to the world, Chris had finally snapped, becoming the very monster he had spent his life hunting. This was the ultimate expression of Chris's emotional isolation. He no longer felt the need to explain himself to civilians. He believed that the mission was too sensitive and the threat too great for the truth to be shared. The mayor Chris shot was, in reality, the shape-shifting Mother Miranda, who had infiltrated the Winters' home to abduct Rosemary. Chris knew that Miranda was a biological entity of immense power, and that any hesitation would lead to the deaths of everyone in the room. He chose the most direct and brutal path to neutralize the threat, regardless of how it looked. This decision showed a man who had completely surrendered his humanity to the instrument mindset. He was a weapon that fired when the target was identified, leaving the moral and emotional fallout for later. He had become a man who operated on a level of necessary evil that even the younger S.T.A.R.S Chris would have found abhorrent. The silence Chris maintained during the operation was a tactical choice, but also a symptom of his terminal weariness. He didn't have the energy to argue with Ethan, or to provide the context of the Megamycete. He believed that by keeping Ethan in the dark, he was keeping him safe. This was a catastrophic failure of leadership and empathy, a result of decades of watching everyone he cared about die. Chris had forgotten how to communicate with people who weren't soldiers. He treated Ethan like a civilian asset that needed to be moved, rather than a human being who had just watched his wife be murdered. This action solidified Chris's reputation as the villain for the first half of the village incident. He allowed himself to be hated, to be hunted, and to be misunderstood, all for the sake of the mission. He was a man who had moved beyond the need for approval. He was the ghost who did the dirty work so that the world could continue to sleep. The death of Mia was a calculated tactical strike that revealed the profound emptiness at the center of Chris's life. He was a man who could shoot a woman in her own home and then walk away into the snow without a second glance. The fallout of this action would eventually force Chris to confront the limits of his instrument philosophy. He realized that by isolating himself and Ethan, he had created a chaotic variable that he couldn't control. The death of Mia was the breaking point for Chris's old way of operating. It was the moment he realized that being a shield wasn't enough if you ended up crushing the people you were supposed to protect. He was a soldier who had forgotten that the mission is supposed to serve humanity, not the other way around. Part 29. The Houndwolf Squad. To execute his clandestine operation against Mother Miranda and the Megamycete, Chris Redfield bypassed the BSAA's official channels and formed his own elite unit, the Houndwolf Squad. Comprised of veteran operatives who were loyal to Chris personally rather than to the Alliance, Houndwolf was a black ops team that operated outside the law and beyond any government oversight. This was Chris's final rejection of the chain of command. He had seen the corruption in the Air Force, the treachery in S.T.A.R.S, and the bureaucracy in the B.S.A.A, and he decided that the only people he could trust were the ones he had handpicked himself. The Houndwolf Squad represented Chris's chosen family. They were soldiers who understood his silence and shared his grim dedication to the mission. They operated with a level of coordination and lethality that made traditional military units look amateurish. Chris was their alpha, the leader who led from the front and expected nothing less than absolute perfection. In the snowy, nightmare landscape of the Romanian village, Houndwolf acted as the surgical edge of Chris's plan, conducting reconnaissance and tactical strikes, while Ethan Winters blundered through the horrors of the Four Lords. The existence of Houndwolf showed Chris's transition into a warlord figure, a man who commanded his own private army to fight a private war. He was no longer a servant of the state. He was a law unto himself. This was a dangerous evolution, a reflection of the very independent power that had made Umbrella so lethal. However, Chris believed his moral compass was enough to justify the lack of oversight. He was a man who had been failed by every institution he ever served. So he built his own. The squad was his shield against the world, a small circle of trust in a universe of betrayal. Within the squad, Chris was respected but distant. He maintained a professional wall that ensured he would never have to suffer the loss of another Piers Nivans. He kept the mission clinical, the debriefings short, and the emotional connections non-existent. Houndwolf was an extension of his own instrument philosophy, a group of highly specialized tools designed to perform a specific function. They were the ghosts of the B.S.A.A, the ones who did the work that the Alliance was too compromised or too slow to handle. By the end of the village operation, the Houndwolf Squad had become the most effective anti-bioweapon unit in the world. They were the only ones who knew the truth about the B.S.A.A's corruption and the Megamycete's origin. Chris looked at his team and saw the only thing he had left to show for 30 years of war. They were his legacy, the children of his tactical genius and his emotional trauma. They were the ones who would carry on the fight when he finally became a ghost for real. A thought that Chris accepted with a quiet, somber pride. Part 30. Miranda's Plan. The investigation into the Romanian village revealed a threat that predated even the Umbrella Corporation. Mother Miranda, a woman who had lived for over a century through the power of the Megamycete, was revealed to be the mentor of Oswell E. Spencer. She and Chris Redfield realized that the entire history of modern biological warfare, from the S.T.A.R.S betrayal to the Uroboros project, was a mere footnote in Miranda's much older and more personal quest to resurrect her dead daughter. This revelation was a profound shock. Chris had been fighting the children of a conspiracy when the mother had been hiding in the mountains all along. Miranda's plan involved the use of Rosemary Winters as a vessel for her daughter's soul, a biological restructuring that would have required the total consumption of the child's humanity. Chris saw in Miranda the ultimate evolution of the God complex that had driven Wesker and the Ashfords. She viewed human lives as mere components in a century-long experiment, a perspective that Chris found fundamentally offensive. He realized that the Megamycete was the virus, the source of the mold, and the catalyst for the entire nightmare. To stop Miranda was to cut the root of the tree that had been poisoning the world for decades. The operation against Miranda was Chris's most complex tactical challenge. He had to navigate a village that was a literal organism, controlled by a woman who could reshape reality through fungal manipulation. Chris moved through the chaos with a cold, analytical focus, identifying the weak points in Miranda's children, the Four Lords, while staying out of the way of Ethan Winter's desperate rampage. He realized that Miranda's arrogance was her greatest weakness. She had spent 100 years playing God, and had forgotten what a determined human being was capable of. Miranda's plan also exposed the deep corruption within the B.S.A.A. Chris discovered that the Alliance had been monitoring Miranda for years, and had even begun to experiment with biological soldiers based on her research. This was the final betrayal for Chris. The organization he had founded to stop bioterrorism was now using it. He realized that Miranda was not just a monster in the mountains. She was a mirror of the world's obsession with power. He fought not just to save a child, but to erase a legacy of madness that had claimed every person he had ever loved. By the time the final confrontation arrived, Chris had become the executioner of a century. He stood amidst the fungal roots of the Megamycete, a man of modern steel and gunpowder, facing a goddess of ancient rot. He didn't care about her tragic history or her scientific breakthroughs. He only cared about the mission. Miranda's plan was a masterpiece of biological engineering, but Chris Redfield was a master of ending such masterpieces. He was the ghost of the future, come to put the past in its grave once and for all. Part 31. The Weight of Secrecy. As the winter storms battered the Romanian mountain range, the weight of the secrecy Chris Redfield maintained began to fracture the very foundation of his operation. By choosing to keep Ethan Winters in the dark about Mother Miranda's infiltration of his home, Chris had inadvertently created a volatile wildcard that threatened to derail the Houndwolf Squad's precision. Chris believed that the truth was a burden a civilian could not carry, a perspective born from decades of seeing normal people break under the pressure of biological reality. However, this silence was not just a tactical choice. It was a symptom of Chris's own terminal emotional fatigue. He had spent so long operating in the shadows that he had forgotten how to communicate with anyone who didn't wear a tactical headset. The isolation Chris forced upon himself during these hours was absolute. Even as he monitored Ethan's progress through the territories of the Four Lords, he remained a distant, silent figure, watching from the ridges while Ethan fought through the horrors of the reservoir and the stronghold. This was a cold, calculated test of Ethan's utility as a distraction. Chris was essentially using a grieving father as a stalking horse to draw Miranda's attention away from the Houndwolf Squad's true objective, the megamycete core. The shield had become a cloak, and the secrecy was the fabric Chris used to hide his own guilt. Within the command center of the Houndwolf Squad, the tension regarding this secrecy was palpable. His elite operatives, while loyal, questioned the wisdom of allowing a desperate and confused civilian to roam a high-intensity combat zone without intelligence. Chris dismissed these concerns with a professional coldness that masked his internal conflict. He convinced himself that by hoarding the pain and the truth, he was saving Ethan from a reality that would shatter him, failing to see that the lie was doing the shattering instead. He was a man who had forgotten that in a war of biology, the psychological state of the survivors is just as important as the ammunition in their rifles. This period of the mission revealed the darker side of Chris's legendary status. He had become so accustomed to being the only one who knows that he had developed a god complex of his own, albeit one rooted in protection rather than power. He was deciding who lived, who died, and who was allowed to know the reason why. The weight of this secrecy sat on his shoulders like lead, slowing his reactions and clouding his judgment. He was no longer the teammate who shared a laugh in the S.T.A.R.S office. He was a monolith of classified information, standing alone in the snow. Ultimately, the secrecy served to alienate the only ally Chris had left in the village. By the time he was forced to come clean, the damage to the relationship between the two men was irreparable. Chris realized too late that secrecy is not a shield. It is a wall that prevents the very cooperation necessary for survival. He had tried to protect Ethan from the truth, but in doing so, he had exposed him to a level of unnecessary terror that would eventually lead to the mission's most tragic conclusion. Part 32. The Truth Revealed. The moment of revelation finally occurred in the bowels of Carl Heisenberg's industrial factory, where the friction between Chris's secrecy and Ethan's desperation reached a violent, near-fatal head. When Chris finally came face to face with Ethan and admitted that the Mia he had executed was actually a shape-shifting Mother Miranda, the relief he expected did not come. Instead, he saw the look of utter betrayal and bone-deep exhaustion in Ethan's eyes. This was a moment of profound failure for the legend. Chris admitted, in a rare and fleeting moment of vulnerability, that he should have told Ethan the truth from the beginning. A confession that his instrument, philosophy, had failed the very person it was meant to serve. The truth revealed more than just the identity of a shapeshifter. It laid bare the entire century of madness that had birthed the village's horrors. Chris explained the nature of the Kijuju parasites and the genetic obsession that had turned Mother Miranda into a goddess of rot. But as he spoke, the tactical data felt hollow compared to the human cost Ethan had paid. Chris stood before Ethan not as a towering hero, but as a man whose tactical rigidity had caused a father to suffer 1,000 unnecessary deaths. For the boulder-punching exterior was finally stripped away, revealing a man who realized that his silence had been a weapon used against his own side. This revelation was the turning point for the mission's eventual success, but it came at a terrible price. Once the truth was out, the friction between Chris and Ethan transformed into a desperate, frantic cooperation. Chris provided Ethan with the tactical information he needed to face Miranda, while the Houndwolf Squad moved to plant the explosives on the megamycete's core. The truth had a cleansing effect, stripping away the pretenses and leaving behind two men who had nothing left to lose. Chris realized that Ethan's humanity was not a weakness to be protected, but a weapon that Miranda had failed to account for in her calculations. However, the truth also carried a darker realization regarding the global state of affairs. Chris informed Ethan that the B.S.A.A. had been compromised, and that they were now operating as a rogue unit. This was the final bridge being burned in Chris's mind. The truth revealed that there was no cavalry coming, no government to fall back on, and no law to protect them in the mountains. They were two ghosts fighting an ancient god in a forgotten corner of the world. Chris accepted this reality with a grim satisfaction, finally comfortable in the dark, now that the lies had been cleared away. The revelation ended with a renewed sense of purpose, but the damage to Chris's psyche was permanent. He had seen the result of his silent protector routine and found it wanting. He vowed that if they made it out, things would change. But the look on Ethan's face told him that making it out was no longer a certainty. The truth had been a long time coming, and though it arrived in time to save the world, it arrived too late to save the bond between the soldier and the civilian. Chris moved toward the final confrontation with the clarity of a man who has finally seen his own reflection and didn't like what he saw. Part 33, the Megamycete Revelation. The discovery of the Megamycete, the black god residing beneath the village, shifted the scope of the war for Chris Redfield from a localized outbreak to an existential threat. This was not just another laboratory-manufactured virus. It was a fungal superorganism that acted as a biological hard drive, just storing the memories and the DNA of everyone it had ever consumed over the course of a century. Chris realized that he was standing in the presence of an entity that predated the modern era of bioterrorism. The Megamycete was the source of Mother Miranda's power, and the origin of the mold that had destroyed the Baker family in Louisiana years prior. For Chris, the Megamycete was the ultimate expression of the horror he had been fighting since 1998. It represented the total loss of individuality and the finality of death. If the Megamycete was allowed to spread, humanity would become a collective, fungal nightmare, where souls were just data points in a black, oily mass. Chris moved through the underground caverns, his skin crawling as he saw the pulsating roots of the organism. He realized that this was the root of the tree that Oswald Spencer had tried to prune to create his own vision of utopia. The revelation was clear. As long as the Megamycete existed, the threat of biological restructuring would never end. The Houndwolf Squad's mission to destroy the Megamycete was the most dangerous undertaking of Chris's long career. They were essentially trying to kill a god with conventional explosives and tactical nuclear ordnance. Chris had to navigate a landscape that was physically reacting to his presence, the mold itself manifesting as a sentient defense mechanism. The revelation of the Megamycete's power also explained the corruption within the B.S.A.A. The organization had seen the potential of a memory bank virus and wanted to harness it for their own ends. Chris was no longer just fighting a monster. He was fighting the very concept of biological immortality. This realization also shed light on the tragic nature of Ethan Winters. Chris discovered through Miranda's notes and his own observations that Ethan had actually died in the Baker house 3 years ago and had been a creature of the mold ever since. This revelation added a layer of tragic irony to their relationship. The man Chris had been trying to protect was already technically one of the monsters. Yet, Ethan's refusal to surrender to the fungus, even as his body began to crumble into salt and ash, was the ultimate proof of the human spirit. Chris saw that the Megamycete could take the body and the memory, but it couldn't take the will of a father. The destruction of the megamycete became Chris's singular, burning focus. He saw it as the patient zero of the world's current misery, the source of every tragedy he had witnessed in his adult life. By planting the charges at the core of the Black God, he was attempting to close the book on a century of madness. He stood in the heart of the fungal nightmare, a man of flesh and blood, facing down a collective consciousness, and felt a profound sense of rightness. This was the war he was born to fight. The megamycete revelation was the final piece of the puzzle, and Chris Redfield was the man who would finally smash the picture into pieces. Part 34. Ethan's Sacrifice. The climax of the village incident saw Chris Redfield witness a sacrifice that echoed the loss of Piers Nivans. But with an even more profound sense of personal tragedy, Ethan Winters, realizing his body was failing and that he could not leave the blast zone without the megamycete reforming, chose to stay behind to detonate the charges. Chris stood at the edge of the escape helicopter, reaching out to the man he had once disparaged as a civilian asset, and saw a level of heroism that matched any S.T.A.R.S veteran. Ethan handed his daughter, Rosemary, to Chris, the ultimate act of trust from a man Chris had betrayed with his silence, and Ethan's sacrifice was the final, devastating blow to Chris's instrument philosophy. He watched as a mere civilian did what Chris had always expected to do, give his life for the future. As the village vanished in a massive fungal explosion that lit up the Romanian sky, Chris realized that he had been wrong about everything. He had tried to be the shield by isolating himself and hoarding the truth, but it was the human connection, the irrational, powerful love of a father that had actually saved the world. Chris sat in the back of the transport, clutching the infant Rose, and felt a sense of defeat that outweighed the tactical victory. This sacrifice added yet another name to the list of people who died to keep Chris Redfield alive and the world turning. Ethan Winters became a ghost that would haunt Chris's later years, a constant reminder of the cost of secrecy and the power of the individual. Chris looked at Rose and saw the living legacy of Ethan's courage. He realized that his new mission was not just to fight, but to protect the life that Ethan had died to preserve. The sacrifice was a moment of clarity that stripped away the last of Chris's professional cynicism, leaving behind a man who was deeply, painfully aware of his own failings as a leader. The image of Ethan standing amidst the ruins, holding the detonator as the world collapsed around him, became a permanent fixture in Chris's mind. It served as a rebuke to his lone wolf tendencies and his belief that only the trained elite could make a difference. He realized that he could not carry the world on his shoulders alone, and that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the people he thought were the weakest. The sacrifice in the snow was the end of the village era, and the beginning of a new, even more somber chapter in Chris's life. As the helicopter flew away from the burning mountains, Chris made a silent, solemn vow to Ethan's ghost. He would raise Rose as if she were his own. He would hunt the corrupt elements within the B.S.A.A., and he would never again let his silence be the reason a good man died alone in the dark. Ethan's sacrifice was the final forging of Chris's soul, a fire that burned away the coldness of the ghost and replaced it with a heavy, focused sense of paternal duty. Chris Redfield was still a soldier, but now he was a soldier who understood that the mission is only worth as much as the lives it saves. Section 8. The Psychological Throughline. Part 35. From Idealist to Instrument. The arc of Chris Redfield's life is a tragic study in the erosion of the human spirit by the tides of war. In 1998, He was the quintessential American hero, a hot-blooded pilot with a sharp wit and a deep belief in the power of a team. He fought for justice and truth, concepts that he believed were as tangible as the bullets in his magazine. However, each subsequent encounter with the biological abyss stripped away a piece of that idealism. The betrayal of Wesker destroyed his trust in authority. The loss of his squad in Edonia destroyed his belief in himself. And the sacrifice of Piers Nivans destroyed his hope for a future outside of the military. By the time he reached his 50s, Chris had successfully transitioned from an idealist into a clinical, tactical instrument. He stopped viewing the world in terms of good and evil and began viewing it in terms of containment and hazard. His personality became a secondary concern to his utility as a weapon. This was a self-imposed exile from humanity. He believed that to save the world, he had to stop being a part of it. He became a man of routine and silence, his massive physical frame a shell designed to protect a heart that had been broken too many times to heal. He was the shield of humanity, but a shield is an object, not a person. This transformation was most visible in his treatment of Ethan Winters during the village incident. The younger Chris Redfield would have been a mentor and a friend. The instrument, Chris, was a cold observer who used a grieving father as a strategic asset. He had become so focused on the macro level of global survival that he had lost the ability to navigate the micro level of human emotion. He believed that his silence was a tactical advantage, failing to see that it was actually a symptom of his terminal emotional fatigue. He was a man who could calculate the trajectory of a rocket, but could no longer navigate the complexities of a conversation. The tragedy of the instrument phase is that it made Chris incredibly effective, but fundamentally lonely. He was the most respected soldier on the planet, but there was no one left who truly knew him. Jill Valentine remained the only link to his past, but even that relationship was strained by the weight of their shared trauma. Chris had become a ghost in his own life, a man who lived between the lines of mission reports and tactical briefings. He had sacrificed his self to become the solution, a bargain that ensured the world's survival at the cost of his own peace and identity. Ultimately, Chris Redfield's journey from idealist to instrument is a warning about the cost of eternal war. He is the man who outlived his own humanity to ensure that others could keep theirs. He stands as a sentinel at the edge of the abyss, a man of steel and gunpowder who has forgotten how to be anything else. He is the definitive soldier of the 21st century, a man who has become the very thing he needed to be to survive the darkness, only to realize that the light of a normal life no longer recognizes him. Part 36. Survivor's guilt that never fades. If there is a single primary motivator for Chris Redfield, it is the crushing, inescapable weight of survivor's guilt. It is the invisible passenger in every helicopter he boards, and the shadow in every room he enters. From the moment he found the severed remains of Kevin Dooley in the Arklay forest, Chris has been haunted by the question of why he is the one who survives while the better people perish. He has outlived 3 different generations of partners and squads. Enrico Marini, Forrest Spire, Richard Aiken, the entire Edonia unit, Piers Nivans, and finally Ethan Winters. Each name is a scar on his psyche that never quite closes. This guilt has warped Chris's sense of self-worth into something transactional and grim. He believes that his life is a debt that he can never truly pay back to the dead. Every mission he takes, every monster he kills, and every night he spends in the trenches is an attempt to justify the fact that his heart is still beating, while so many others have stopped. He doesn't fight for glory or for a paycheck. He fights because he feels he doesn't deserve to rest, while the ghosts of his past are still watching. The boulder-punching strength the world sees is actually a manifestation of this guilt, a desperate need to be strong enough so that, next time, he won't be the only one standing in the ruins. The guilt also dictates his profound social isolation. Chris views himself as a carrier of misfortune, a man whose presence is a death sentence for those he allows into his inner circle. This is why he pushed his sister, Claire, away for years, why he kept Ethan Winters in the dark, and why he maintains a professional wall with the Houndwolf Squad. He believes that by being alone, he is saving others from the Redfield curse. He has become a man who mourns the living as much as the dead, always waiting for the moment the mission will claim the next person standing next to him. His survival is not a triumph to him. It is a recurring punishment. In his later years, this guilt has matured into a somber, almost religious sense of duty. He no longer rages against the loss. He simply carries it as a part of his kit. He spends his rare off hours in quiet reflection, often visiting memorials or simply sitting in the silence of his thoughts, mentally reciting the names of the fallen. He is a man who lives in a graveyard of memories, and his only comfort is the knowledge that he is still the one holding the line. The guilt is the fire that keeps him warm in the cold zones of the world, a reminder that he has a responsibility to ensure their sacrifices weren't in vain. Survivor's guilt is the through line that connects the rebellious pilot of 1998 to the weary commander of 2026. It is the one thing that the viruses, the parasites, and the corporate conspiracies couldn't take from him. It is his burden, his motivation, and his curse. Chris Redfield is a man who is running a race against his own ghosts, and he knows that the only way to win is to never stop moving until he finally joins them. He is the survivor who refuses to forgive himself, and that is what makes him the most dangerous man in the world. Part 37. Why Chris Cannot Retire. For Chris Redfield, the concept of retirement is a death sentence of a different kind. His entire identity is so inextricably tied to the war against bioterrorism that he no longer knows who Chris Redfield is without a rifle in his hand and a mission objective in his mind. If he were to stop fighting, he would have to sit in the deafening silence and face the ghosts of everyone he has lost. The noise of combat and the adrenaline of the field are the only things loud enough to drown out the screams of the past. He defines himself by the enemy he is currently hunting. Without a Wesker or a Miranda to focus on, he is a man without a purpose, a weapon gathering dust in a closet. Furthermore, he carries the heavy burden of the legend. He believes that if he stops, the world will fall, because no one else has the experience to hold the line. This is the arrogance of the veteran, the belief that he is the only one who truly understands the nature of the biological threat. He sees the corruption in the B.S.A.A. and the rising tide of the black market, and realizes that there is no one else with his level of institutional memory. He is a soldier who has forgotten how to be a civilian. To Chris, peace is just the interval between outbreaks, a time to train harder and prepare for the next inevitable catastrophe. His physical state also prevents retirement. He has pushed his body so far beyond human limits that he is effectively a biological anomaly himself. He requires the high-intensity environment of the battlefield to feel alive. When he is not on a mission, he is in the gym or on the firing range. maintaining a level of readiness that is unsustainable for a normal life. He cannot imagine a world of quiet suburbs or office work. His hands are built for triggers and steering wheels, not for retirement. He is a creature of the conflict, and he knows that he will likely die with his boots on, which is exactly how he wants it. Just there is also the matter of his family. The B.S.A.A. and the Houndwolf Squad are the only community he has left. To retire would be to abandon the only people who understand him. He feels a paternal responsibility for the young operatives under his command, believing that if he stays, he can prevent them from making the same mistakes he did. He is the old man of the war, the one who stays in the trenches so that the next generation might have a chance to one day walk away. He stays because he doesn't want anyone else to have to carry the weight he does. In the end, Chris Redfield cannot retire because he is the war. He has spent 30 years fighting the darkness until he became a part of it. He is the sentinel at the gate, the one who stands in the cold so that the rest of the world can stay warm. He will stay on the front lines until his heart finally stops beating, or a monster finally catches up to him. He doesn't fight for hope anymore. He fights because it is the only thing he knows how to do. Retirement is for people who have something to go back to, and Chris Redfield left his life behind in a mansion in 1998. Part 38, Leadership as Isolation. As Chris Redfield rose through the ranks to become a legendary commander, his leadership style evolved into a form of absolute self-imposed isolation. He lead from the front, but he lead from a distance. He demanded perfection and absolute discipline from his subordinates, because he couldn't bear to see another name added to his list of casualties. However, this very demand made him an unapproachable myth to the rank and file. He became a man who gave orders with clinical precision, but never shared his thoughts or his fears. He was the almighty alpha, a figure of awe rather than a teammate. Within the Houndwolf Squad, this isolation reached its peak. While the team was fiercely loyal to him, they operated under a cloud of his silence. Chris maintained a professional wall that ensured he would never have to suffer the loss of another son like Piers Nivans. He kept the mission clinical and the debriefings short. He had become a king of a graveyard, a leader who had lost the ability to be a partner. He was respected by everyone in the Alliance, but known by absolutely no one. This isolation was the high price of his legacy. He was the most famous soldier in the world, but he was fundamentally alone. This leadership style also created a dangerous lack of oversight. Because Chris was a living legend, no one in the B.S.A.A. felt they could question his methods or his decisions. This allowed him to operate as a law unto himself, leading to the clandestine and morally grey operations seen in the village incident. He had become a warlord for the cause of good, a man who believed that his experience justified his lack of accountability. His isolation prevented him from seeing the flaws in his own plans, such as the catastrophic decision to keep Ethan Winters in the dark. The burden of leadership for Chris is the burden of zero tolerance. He knows that in a war against bioweapons, a single tactical error can result in a global extinction event. This pressure has turned him into a man of silence and shadows. He no longer seeks consensus or explanation. He simply executes the plan he believes is right. He is a man who carries the world's survival on his shoulders, and he believes that sharing that weight would only slow him down. He is the ghost at the head of the table, a leader who is followed out of duty and fear of what happens if he ever stops. By the late 2020s, Chris's leadership had become a study in the tragedy of authority. He had all the power in the world to save people, but he had lost the ability to connect with them. He was a commander of ghosts leading a squad of hunters, moving through a world that didn't understand the cost of its own protection. He is the definitive leader for an age of horror, a man who is perfectly designed to win the war, but who has lost himself in the process of leading the charge. Part 39. The soldier who outlived his war. The ultimate tragedy of Chris Redfield is that he has outlived the very war he was born to fight. The Umbrella Corporation is a ghost of the past. Albert Wesker is a memory in a volcano, and the Arklay Mountains are a restricted zone that the world has tried to forget. Yet, Chris is still in the trenches, still wearing the tactical gear, and still looking for the next threat. He is a relic of the 1990s, a man of T-virus tactics and S.T.A.R.S values. In a world that has moved on to fungal mind control, political corruption, and digital bioterrorism, he is the old soldier who can never go home, because home was a city that was vaporized in 1998. He looks at the modern world and sees a place that has learned absolutely nothing from the tragedy of Raccoon City. The B.S.A.A., the organization he founded with such idealism to be the answer to Umbrella, has become part of the problem. This is the final bitter slap in the face for Chris. He has outlived his enemies only to see his allies and his own legacy become them. He is a man who has won every major battle of his life, but is losing the overall war for humanity's soul. He continues to fight because he is a creature of habit, a soldier who has forgotten that wars are supposed to eventually have an end. His persistence has turned him into a living anachronism. While the rest of the world debates the ethics of biological research and corporate oversight, Chris is still the one on the ground, shooting the monsters. He is the ghost of 1998, a reminder of a simpler time when the enemy wore a lab coat and the goal was just to survive the night. He is out of sync with the modern era of bioterrorism as the norm. He refuses to accept a world where these things exist, while the rest of the planet has simply learned to live with the risk. This displacement is what makes him so dangerous and so effective. He doesn't care about the politics or the PR. He only cares about the infection. He is the only one left who remembers the smell of the mansion and the sound of the hunter's claws. He is the memory of the dead, still patrolling the dark corners of the globe. He is the soldier who outlived his war, but who refuses to put down his rifle until the very last shadow is gone. He is a man waiting for a dawn that he knows he will never see, but he keeps watch anyway, because that is what a S.T.A.R.S operative does. In the end, Chris Redfield is the definitive survivor. He has survived the mansion, the city, the island, the ice, the volcano, and the village. But his greatest challenge is surviving the peace. He is a man who was forged in a fire that has long since gone out, leaving him as a cold, hard piece of iron in a world of soft plastic. He will continue to fight the remnants of Umbrella and the corruption of the B.S.A.A. until there is nothing left of him but the legend. He is the man who never stopped fighting, because he realized that for people like him, the war never truly ends. It just changes its name. Part 40. Obligation over hope. In the modern village era and beyond, Chris Redfield is no longer a man driven by the flickering light of hope. He does not believe that he will ever win the war against bioterrorism, or that the world will ever truly be free of biological threats. He has seen too many corporations rise from the ashes of the old ones to believe in a final victory. Instead, he is driven by a cold, hard, sheer and unbreakable sense of obligation. He fights because he is the only one who can. He protects Rosemary Winters and hunts the corrupt elements of the B.S.A.A. because it is his responsibility as a founder and a survivor. This shift from hope to obligation is what makes the modern Chris so formidable and so tragic. He has no more illusions left to shatter. He knows that he will likely die in a muddy trench or a sterile lab. He has accepted that his life will be a mere footnote in a long history of biological horror. This acceptance gives him a level of focus that is terrifying to his enemies. He is a man who has already lost everything he ever cared about, so he has absolutely nothing left to fear. He stands on the front lines as a weary shield for a world that he no longer feels a part of, driven by the simple, unwavering obligation to be the one who stands between the innocent and the dark. This sense of obligation is what allows him to make the impossible choices. He can shoot a woman in her home or destroy an entire village because he is looking at the long-term survival of the species. He has traded his personal morality for a global necessity. He is the instrument of human survival, a man who has accepted the role of the monster to keep the real monsters at bay. He doesn't expect to be thanked, and he doesn't expect to be understood. He only expects to finish the mission, because the names on his list are watching him, and he cannot let them down. His relationship with the past is now one of duty rather than memory. He doesn't remember the S.T.A.R.S team with a smile. He remembers them as a debt. He doesn't look at his sister Claire as a person to visit, but as a person to keep safe through distance. His entire life is a series of obligations that he checks off with a grim efficiency. He has become the ultimate professional, a man whose only hobby is the maintenance of his gear and the study of his targets. He is the eternal soldier, a man who has traded the warmth of hope for the cold, steady push of duty. Obligation is the only thing that keeps him from falling apart. It is the structure that holds his fractured psyche together. When he wakes up in the morning, he doesn't ask, "What do I want to do?" He asks, "What must be done?" This is the final stage of Chris Redfield's evolution. He has moved beyond the emotions of his youth and the rage of his middle years into a state of pure, functional obligation. He is the man who stays because everyone else left, and he will stay until the very end, not because he thinks he can win, but because someone has to be there to lose with dignity. Sheesh Part 41. The future of the B.S.A.A. The revelation at the conclusion of the village operation that the B.S.A.A. has begun using biological soldier weapons in the field is the final catalyst for Chris Redfield's next and likely final mission. He realized that the institution he dedicated his entire adult life to building has been hollowed out from within, becoming a mirror of the very corporation it was meant to replace. The sight of a B.S.A.A. soldier that was clearly a mutated organism was the ultimate betrayal for Chris. He saw that the cycle of Umbrella was repeating itself, this time under the banner of the good guys. The future of the B.S.A.A. is now Chris's primary target. This realization has turned Chris into a revolutionary once again. He is no longer an observer or a commander within the Alliance. He is the man who is coming to tear the house down. He has taken the Houndwolf Squad and headed for the B.S.A.A. Europe headquarters, prepared to wage a private war against the organization he helped found. This is the ultimate full circle for his character arc. He began his career by rebelling against the corruption of the Air Force and the S.T.A.R.S program, and he will likely end it by destroying the B.S.A.A. He is the ghost who is coming home to haunt the people who sold out his dream for the sake of tactical advantage. The future for Chris is one of absolute conflict. He must dismantle a global organization that possesses the very technology he spent 30 years trying to contain. He is now the enemigo numero uno for the world's most powerful anti-bioterrorism agency. This doesn't scare him, it clarifies him. He is finally fighting an enemy he understands perfectly, a corporation that thinks it can control the uncontrollable. He is moving toward a final confrontation that will decide the fate of biological research for the next century. He is the old guard coming to put the new guard in its place. Within this conflict, Chris will have to face the very people he trained and the very systems he designed. It is a war against his own legacy. He is the architect of the B.S.A.A's strength, and now he must be the architect of its destruction. This is a heavy, somber mission, but it is one that Chris accepts with a grim satisfaction. He would rather be the one to kill the B.S.A.A than see it become the next umbrella. He is the guardian who is willing to burn the garden if it means the weeds don't spread to the rest of the world. As he prepares for the assault on the B.S.A.A, Chris Redfield is the most dangerous he has ever been. He has the experience of a veteran, the gear of a super soldier, and the motivation of a man who has nothing left to lose. The future is not one of peace, but of a messy, internecine conflict where the ghost of 1998 will finally have his say. He is the man who will ensure that the name Umbrella never rises again, even if it is currently wearing a B.S.A.A patch. The war is far from over. For Chris Redfield, it is just getting started for the final time. Part 42. The man who never stopped fighting. A final psychological autopsy of Chris Redfield reveals a man who is the physical and emotional embodiment of human resilience in the face of absolute horror. He is the soldier who never stopped fighting, not because he was the strongest or the smartest man in the room, but because he was the most persistent. He has been the point of the human race's defense for over 30 years, taking the physical hits and the psychological losses so that the rest of the world didn't have to. He is a man of 1,000 scars, both visible and invisible, a legendary figure who is, at his core, still just a rebellious pilot who refused to let his friends die alone in a mansion. His life is a testament to the fact that even in a world of biological gods, fungal collective minds, and corporate monsters, a single human being with a rifle, a code, and the will to keep moving can still change the course of history. Chris Redfield is the definitive survivor. He has outlived his enemies, his allies, and his own youth. He has been a police officer, a rogue agent, a founder, a commander, and a ghost. He has seen the worst that humanity and biology have to offer, and he has never once blinked. He is the man who stared into the abyss until the abyss was forced to look away. As he looks toward the final horizon, Chris remains the shield. He is weary, he is fundamentally alone, and he is haunted by a list of names that grows longer every year, but he is still standing. He has accepted that his life is the war, and that there is no after for people like him. He has found a strange kind of peace in the constant combat, a clarity that only comes when the stakes are life or death. He is the man who outlived his war, and he will continue to patrol the dark corners of the globe until his body finally gives out, or a monster finally catches up to him. He is the legacy of the S.T.A.R.S program, the one who made it out and kept the spirit of the unit alive. He is the protector of Rose Winters, the judge of the B.S.A.A, and the nightmare of the black market. He is a man who has traded everything for the chance to say no to the dark. Chris Redfield is more than just a soldier. He is a symbol of human grit. He is the ghost of 1998, still in the trenches, still watching, and still ready to strike. He is the man who never stopped fighting, because he realized a long time ago that as long as he is fighting, the names on his list are still alive in his heart. His story is one of tragedy and triumph in equal measure. He has saved millions of lives, but he has lost the one life he wanted for himself. He is the quintessential hero of the biological age, a man of iron will who stands as the final barrier between civilization and the virus. As the sun sets on his long career, Chris Redfield remains exactly where he began, in the field, with a mission in his sights and a partner in his ear, moving forward into the dark. He is the man who will never stop, because the world still needs a legend to keep it safe.